So we are going to begin. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Nina Stritzler-Levine. I am director of the Bard Graduate Center Gallery and Gallery Publications. And on behalf of Susan Weber, our founder and director, I want to welcome you to this evening's program, Gloria Steinem in Conversation with Barbara Nissen, moderated by Marianne LaMonica, the gallery's chief curator, who joined our staff 2 years ago after a long tenure at the Wolfsonian in Miami. Tonight's event is being live streamed off our website on BGC TV, so I would also like to extend a welcome to those who have joined us from the outside. And just a few kind of house rules and information. We live in a time where I have to ask you to turn off your cell phone. So if you haven't done it already, please do so they don't ring during this program. I would like to also tell you that we have a filmmaker with us. That filmmaker is connected with ARC Media for the PBS show Finding Your Roots. That's hosted, some of you might know, by Henry Louis Gates. And that he is doing a program that will feature Gloria that will air in the fall of 2015. But let me begin a more formal introduction by saying a few words about the mission of the Bard Graduate Center that I believe very much informs tonight's event. As a leading international research institute, the Bard Graduate Center mission is to foster new knowledge and understanding of human civilization through the study of the material world. The term material world encompasses the most basic everyday objects or things, utensils, the most richly embellished objects, an illustration, a document that generates thought and ideas. Our research institute engages in a rather extraordinary range of activities, awarding MA and PhD degrees. Our students and faculty are at the heart of an institution that is centered on learning. Then there is the now internationally acclaimed Fellows Program, seminars, lectures, symposium, publications, including a journal, West 86th Street, and a book series, Cultural History of the Material World, published by the University of Chicago. Inextricably linked to teaching and research is the Bard Graduate Center Gallery. I hope most of you have visited, but if you haven't, you should know that it is a few doors down the street at number 18 West 86th Street. The gallery caters to both the academic community, our own and the larger one, and to a wider public audience. Our exhibitions and gallery publications, many published with Yale University Press, are grounded in the Institute's overall mission. I'm going to repeat it: to foster knowledge and greater understanding of human civilization through the study of the material world. The gallery also has an education program that organizes events like tonight's to complement our exhibitions, lectures, concerts, tours, and a dynamic outreach program, including the sought-after Suitcase Project that brings our exhibitions into the classrooms of public schools and private schools across the 5 boroughs of New York City, and I encourage you to learn more about our programs on our website. Turning to this evening's program, I would like to thank all those at the Bard Graduate Center whose hard work helped to make this event possible. Foremost, Melissa Gerstein and Marianne. I would also like to thank our guests, Gloria Steinem and Barbara Nissen, for their participation in this program that is organized in conjunction with the exhibition Barbara Nissen, An Artful Life, the first comprehensive study of Nissen's work, curated by Douglas Dodd, curator of digital media at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, with Marianne. It is truly an honor to introduce Gloria Steinem. Perhaps in this regard, one must ask, how does one go about such a task? Gloria Steinem has come to personify the pursuit of equality for women, the cause for which she is best known, but her life's work that thankfully continues unabated as a writer and activist is far-reaching and pioneering in multiple areas. Her life work is fighting oppression, subordination, racism, violence, and injustice. After graduating from Smith College in 1956, Steinem spent 2 years in India, writing for Indian publications. Then she came under the influence of Gandhian activism. Her plight, that began with the quest for women's rights, has been recognized with an extraordinary list of emendations. The first honorary doctorate of human justice awarded by Simmons College, the Bill of Rights Award from the American Civil Liberties Union, the Ceres Medal from the United Nations. In 1993, she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls. If you haven't gone there, you should. Steinem helped to found New York Magazine in 1968, and in 1972, the groundbreaking Ms. Magazine, where she remained as editor for 15 years. But I would like to emphasize the necessity of her work today. Think about it. The ways in which this need, the necessity of her work, is reflected in contemporary discourse. An article that appeared just a week ago in the Sunday, November 30th issue of the New York Times, When Women's Goals Hit a Wall of Old Realities, in which Claire Kane Miller elucidated the prevailing struggle against the glass ceiling for women and the conflicts that derive from women needing to choose between and juggle having children, time for their family, and the workplace. Gloria Steinem began tackling these issues 6 decades ago. One of the earliest examples of her writing, Anonymous Was a Woman, a book review from 1968 that also appeared in the New York Times, focused on the book by Caroline Bird, Born Female, The High Cost of Keeping Women Down, in which Steinem asked the most basic question: when will change come? And while undoubtedly enormous strides have been made since the pioneering efforts of Gloria Steinem began, today she personifies the necessity to keep asking this question: when will change come? We know the absolute need to ask this question. The events hit very close to home. Protests last night in New York City, where those who must be considered her fellow activists, and I truly believe that, were willing to literally lay down in Grand Central Station or stand strong together on the West Side Highway to defend justice for all. Now, if Gloria Steinem's life work has taken the form of public activism, Barbara Nissen's practice must be understood as well as a form of activism through art, through images and representations, especially this one, Superman Carrying Girl, that using the language of the French philosopher Michel Foucault, I would argue enunciates the discourse of oppression in her work. Quoting from the exhibition, this image was, quote, about sexual stereotypes, about women being carried away to their dream life, home, family, security by their very own Superman. But the woman, of course, is without a head and bare-breasted. Here in a work that dates to the mid-1960s, Barbara Nissen's practice as an artist and Gloria Steinem's as writer-activist find an early point of intersection. When asked, and I did so, Nissen more readily describes her practice simply as art, or with pride, I am an illustrator. Perhaps more hesitant to articulate the intentionality of praxis as meaning in her overall practice, a situation recognized in a recent article in the Huffington Post, How to Be a Revolutionary Feminist Artist While Hardly Noticing. The exhibition reveals such intentionality to be present. We see this in the materiality of illustration and drawing, the many images that I would argue evoke struggle directly, and in the dichotomy of representations, especially the striking opposition in her work between woman as oppressed and woman as all-powerful. Moreover, Nissen personifies imposed hierarchies of artistic production that position illustration below other practices. Illustration, as we know, largely exists outside the financial and institutional structures of power that shape the art world. A native New Yorker, Nessim received a BFA from Pratt Institute, and since the 1960s, she has been artist and illustrator, and since the 1970s, an educator, teaching at Pratt, SVA, FIT, and Parsons School of Design, where she was chair of the illustration department from 1992 to 1994. The exhibition at the Bard Graduate Center derives from a smaller show at the V&A based on a donation of her work to the Department of Word and Image that was also curated by Douglas Dodd. As I turn the evening over to Marianne LaMonica, I invite you to think about the illuminating words of Hannah Pitkin, Professor Emeritus, University of California at Berkeley, concerning power. Pitkin has explained that the word power relates etymologically to the French word pouvoir, to the Latin potere, both of which mean to be able. Power, according to Pitkin, is something, anything which makes or renders somebody capable of doing something. Power is capacity, potential, ability, and wherewithal. Barbara Nissen's Superwoman, the image that begins the exhibition at the Bard Graduate Center, evokes power. The woman in that representation, unlike this one, I would argue, that also appears on the cover of the book devoted to Nissen's work, is powerful, rather than being the woman who succumbs to the forces of domination. Instead of being the victim, she is the enforcer of power in a way that connotes good. She is woman as powerful, superhero, not oppressor. Just yesterday, I participated in an event where the Bard Graduate Center was described as brave. Tonight, we are in the presence of two women whose lives and life work characterizes bravery in the truest sense of the word. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Marianne LaMonica, and our two guests, Gloria Steinem and Barbara Nissen. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Nina, for that incredibly warm and insightful introduction. And thank you, Gloria and Barbara, for being here. Our conversation tonight is based really in friendship, and that's what we've come here together to talk with Gloria and with Barbara about their friendship and about how these two young working women came to know each other and lived together for a number of years in New York back in the early 1960s. And I was thinking yesterday just about how that was even possible, because I know from Barbara that they lived in a one-room apartment for a while. And I don't know how they didn't drive each other crazy, or maybe they did. And beyond that, what's really incredible is to think that a friendship that was forged in the early 1960s continues today. And so I think that's really a wonderful opportunity to have you here and to show the strength and the power of real friendship. So thank you for that. So let's just begin with, how did you two come to meet each other and to know each other? Either one can start and we can embellish.
Well, we were just saying that we owe it all to the men we were going out with.
Right.
Because I was not part of the art or illustration world. I mean, I was a freelance writer. But I was going out with a very nice man named Robert Benton, who was the art director of Esquire and later became a maker of wonderful movies and so on. And Barbara was going out with Henry Wolfe, who was the previous art director. Anyway, so we remained friends with the men, but we were what lasted.
Yeah, so basically we used to go out to dinner a lot, and Gloria and I would end up talking, and they would end up talking, and I had, my sister was my roommate, and after wanting me to move out, I liked living at home. I was fine living in the Bronx. But she said, no, let's go out. We live in one room here. We could live in one room anywhere. But it turned out that we lived in one room. She didn't like it. So she moved back to the Bronx, and then I was left with the apartment. And I was telling Gloria now I needed a roommate, and Gloria had her apartment, her lease was up, and she said, I'd love to live with you. Is that okay? And I said, okay, but you have to know one thing, two things. I like to stay up late at night, and I'm a little messy, just a little. And she said, that's okay. And we started living together in this one room, and then we moved to another one room on 56th Street, and we lived there the longest time, about 6 years, and then we moved to 2 rooms. We were getting up in the world, and then how we worked that one out is that we would both work in one room, and whoever went to bed first went in the other room, and so we didn't even have our own beds. We just slept wherever it happened, and it worked out perfectly. I mean, we both stayed up late at night, and we got along great.
And Barbara really rescued me because my apartment was going up, this to show you the era, from $150 to I think $180 or $200, which I couldn't afford, so I couldn't, renew the lease. And we were paying together $125.
Right.
It was $62.50.
Right, $62.50. It's perfect.
She really rescued me, so.
I'll have to remember that as a number.
It's partly, as in everything in New York is also a real estate story, right? Okay, it's partly that too.
So can I ask, because as Nina mentioned, Barbara is from New York, she's from the Bronx, but can we ask, how did you make your way to New York to pursue your professional career?
Well, I had gone to, I grew up in the Midwest mainly, and then I had gone to Smith College, and occasionally from Smith we would come here for the weekend. It scared me, the city scared me to death. Everybody seemed to know where they were going except me, and they were all rushing around. And one evening I stopped into a delicatessen in the theater district, and there were showgirls there with huge headdresses from a local show. Very exotic, very beautiful, huge, and nobody was looking at them, nobody was bothering them. It was perfect. And they were there ordering corned beef sandwiches, And I thought, I want to live here. People are free here. Hello. So I just always, it was such a magnet for me. I don't know why, from Ohio. I mean, I would read the Sunday New York Times and dream of a life I didn't know. I just wanted to be here.
And Nina mentioned that after college you went to India for 2 years. And is that where you developed your desire to be a writer, to be a journalist?
I think I always thought about being a writer, but I didn't know it was possible to make a living that way. I just had never seen anybody, especially a female person, but almost anybody, who was making a living that way. So I just always knew that I could get through exams about which I knew nothing because I could write. Right.
Understood.
So it was a presence in my life, and one of my professors said to me, you write so easily and well, you should do something with it. And I said, what do you mean easily? He said, okay, that's it, you're a writer.
That's funny.
And I started to freelance. Well, first when I was first here, I worked for a magazine called Help for Tired Minds, a political satire magazine by Harvey Kurtzman, who invented Mad Magazine, as some of you, right. So because there were 2 of us producing the magazine, just 2 of us, period, I learned a lot about magazines while doing that. And then I began to freelance.
So, and sort of jumping to Barbara, because similarly, I mean, you went to school here in New York, but how did you decide that you wanted to pursue a professional life as an artist? Because many people feel like they're artistic, but they don't take the leap to pursue it as a profession.
Well, I was surprised that I ended up being an illustrator because I thought that I was going to own an advertising agency and that was going to be my fate. That's what I wanted to do. But I didn't really know that much about advertising, but I knew about illustration because that's the path I took at school. And I definitely wanted to make a living as an artist, and I knew that So when I was in school, I would look through the New York Times in the job help wanted section, and I would apply to any job that had an art job. And I would just go on interviews, and one day I got a job. And it was like amazing. It was a freelance job doing coloring for textiles and also doing plaids and stripes. So that was my beginning of when I first started doing it. Then I took my work around as I got a job 3 days a week, and the 2 days a week that I wasn't working, I would take my portfolio around to every art director that would see me, and then on the weekend, if I was lucky enough to get a job, I would do my job. So basically, that was my focus. I definitely wanted to make a living as an illustrator. I definitely wanted to make a living as an artist, and I did it. I can't imagine. I mean, it was like amazing, but I did
You
it.
have to have a lot of guts to do that.
Well, it's just one step after another, and if you had 3 days a week working and you got a steady paycheck, $25 a day, I was very, very lucky I could pay my rent, the $62.50. It adds up.
You mentioned help, and I wonder if you could recount briefly the story of your Playboy expose, because I think there's some value in that relates to Barbara's work as well.
Well, that came later, actually. By that time, I was more or less making a living, our kind of living.
Yeah.
Freelancing. And there was a big, beautiful magazine called Show. I don't know if anybody, I mean, you could not possibly produce this magazine anymore. Each issue was like an entire tree, I mean, it was so huge and gorgeous. And Henry Wolf, a very distinguished art director that probably many of you know, was the art director there. So I used to go to editorial meetings just to suggest ideas. And the Playboy Club was just opening in New York. And they were trying to decide whether to cover it or not. And I suggested that Lillian Ross, does anybody here remember the great Lillian Ross? Okay, that she do it. I mean, that she become a bunny, and I mean, it would have been lethal, right? Okay. But of course, she was, not going to do that and much older, and I was making a joke. And they said, aha, you do it. And I said, wait, I'm already too old to be a bunny. They'll never hire me. I have no identification. But they said, no, do it. Just at least write about the auditions, So that was the way it started. And they were so desperate for employees that they never asked for my, I mean, it's a terrible job, that they hired me. And so I ended up working off and on for a month and writing this expose of working there.
And at the time, after it was written, did you worry that people would know that you had done this undercover job? I mean, did you think you would be discovered?
Oh, yeah.
When you were doing
While I was working there, under my grandmother's name, I was Bunny Marie. Right? It's interesting. I learned that the degree to which we dehumanize each other, because a couple of people I knew came in and just didn't see me at all because I was in the bunny costume. I was a cipher in a way, I mean, and fortunately they didn't recognize me. And the only one who did was the great musician Paul Desmond, and he was our neighbor.
Yeah.
And he came in, and I was, yelling, 3 martinis straight up at the bar or something. And he walked up behind me and he said, "Doing an article?"
Oh, that's good.
So smart.
That's interesting. Well, I mentioned that in part. I mean, it's a fascinating story, and I've read it, and I know a little bit more than what you're saying, and from what you've written about it. But I wanted to talk about that because early on, when you were first out of school, you were working also for men's magazines. Yeah. And I think it's sort of interesting, that you've just told us that you met because of the men you were dating, and then you did that expose, and Barbara was doing the work we saw on the screen before, the Superman image for a gentleman's magazine. So how did that come about? And
They hired me. I was lucky. I mean, it turned out that the only magazines that would hire new artists that would do not kind of boy-girl illustrations and kind of slick, pretty faces and handsome guys doing whatever, that was those magazines, because the people who read the magazines didn't really care about the illustrations. They were just looking at the pictures. And we never got full color. We only got black and white. So I decided to do etchings, but they were the ones who hired people who did interesting work. And you could do whatever you wanted to do because nobody was going to tell you not to do it because they didn't really care. And that was wonderful. And the art directors were all young too. So we had a ball. And not that kind. But it was great.
so, and in that sense, I mean, in terms of living together, did you ever talk about each other's work, critique each other's work?
Yeah.
Sort of share
I know. I
ideas?
would read Gloria's every article that she wrote, and I would just read it and say, well,
What does that mean?
yeah.
Right, which is a great service, you know. And because just living with Barbara was an education in the eye of an artist, because she saw form without function. So I would come home and there would be the silver resist candlesticks and a Babel can that was also silver, and all these objects that looked great together, even though their function made no sense together, you know. So it was an education of the eye.
Interesting.
Yeah, we had this mantelpiece that I kept changing all the time with all different kinds of things. It was
Can you also perhaps, I mean, I sort of hesitate to say this, but we've all now become familiar with the early 60s through Mad Men, and being two young women working in New York, I wonder if you could comment on that moment in terms of getting into the business of journalism, and then for you getting into the business of professional illustration in that era. I mean, the kinds of challenges you faced.
Well, it was much worse than Mad Men, actually. I think because, I mean, I tried to get jobs with advertising agencies, and they were just very clear that you could do research about the product. You could not deal with a client. Clients did not want to deal with women. Even if you had a client, you couldn't go in the lunchroom. You know, you had to have lunch someplace else because it was only men in the, which was true of the Plaza Hotel at lunchtime because the voices of women might disturb men talking about business. You can't make this stuff up, okay? It was actually a lot worse than Mad Men. And I just met in California with Matt Weiner, who was the person who invented and was the showrunner.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just met in California with Matt Weiner, who invented Mad Men, right? And I was trying to tell him how much worse it was. And he said that when the show was first on, he was getting all kinds of hate mail because women who saw it thought he was advocating the attitudes instead of exposing the attitudes. And it took a while to see what his point of view was.
Interesting.
Yeah, I never noticed. Really. I didn't even know that. I knew what I wanted. Any guy who was going to ask me out got the run around like this. You know, I was just very focused on what I was doing. And since it wasn't a job that I had to go in every single day, not counting my textile work, because that was very easy and there was nothing like that going on there. They were just lucky that and happy that I was there, that I would do work with them. But basically, I never really noticed that there was any kind of, I didn't even know I was one of the few women illustrators until I read it in a book. but it's true. If you don't have a place where you go where you see everybody else working and you're just working by yourself as a single person and just having a focus, you don't really know that you're even breaking any ground. And I knew what I didn't want and I knew what I wanted, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted. I just knew what I kind of wanted. And I just kind of tried to be true to my own self and my own work.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
But I didn't have any, I don't feel like I had any, I didn't feel that madman era.
Mm-hmm. The obstacles that
Yeah, I
women
didn't
face.
feel it.
And
Well-
because you felt you weren't inside the agency or inside the magazine, you were able to go in and out of that world.
Yeah, my job didn't depend upon a guy that I was showing my portfolio to. And I did do work for women's magazines as well, like we did that Mademoiselle, I think Glamour was for Glamour together. But basically, women were in women's magazines as art directors, and men were in the agencies, and there were very few women art directors in agencies, and I worked for mostly magazines. So I never came into that.
Right.
And I think probably I had a slightly different experience. I mean, I was also a freelancer. It was clear to me I was not going to work in an office. Because the minute you worked in an office, somebody said, would you make this phone call? Would you type this, or do whatever?
Get me a cup of coffee.
Yeah, right. I mean, I wasn't conscious. I just knew I should not get into it. But I couldn't get political assignments. And since I'd been living in India for a couple of years and I, this was a big interest, I was trying to get political assignments. So I probably became more aware of what the problem was. But I have to say that women always helped each other in my experience. Other, women writers would come into town and I would give them the list of the friendliest editors I knew, who only one of whom asked you to go to a hotel room on the way out. The rest were okay, I mean, we all helped each other.
Mm-hmm. Which reminds me that I was reading some of your work, early work, and I saw some pieces in the New York Times where, for example, you wrote about colorful women's hosiery or the fashions of Rudy Gernrich and things like that. So in that sense, you were freelancing at the time, that your work was being marginalized to sort of these conventional women's things like fashion?
Yeah, the Sunday New York Times Magazine was a good example because I would go and say, I'd love to write about Mayor Lindsay, and they would give me Mayor Lindsay's wife, Mary Lindsay, who was a terrific person, but they, wouldn't give you and I would, propose articles, and they would end up giving me other articles, and I would refuse the first two or three, and then by the third one I would think, but it is the New York Times. So I ended up doing the piece on textured stockings, which was, but I researched the hell out of those textured stockings. I knew what Marie Antoinette wore when she went to the Guild. And about Rudy Gernreich as a designer, some of you remember, right?
So, you also were working for women's magazines, and we showed in the exhibition on view the work that you did for some commercial magazines, but we didn't show the full breadth of the kind of, dare I say, bread and butter work. Mm-hmm. But you did do a lot of work for other magazines like Red Book and other things.
And I was so lucky. I mean, when Red Book decided that they would use me, I was so happy. But I still had to tame my work for Red Book. So it wouldn't be something that I would put, it was definitely something that I was happy to do, but I had to stretch myself in another kind of way that maybe wouldn't have made me so happy to do. But when working for men's magazines, I could do whatever I wanted. Door was open, and I liked that.
I was also reading in your biography and then looked it up that you, very early on, had been asked to write a story about contraception for Esquire. And I was just curious if you could talk about that and the response to it at that moment.
Yeah, that was really my first serious article. It was about the contraceptive pill, which had just then been developed. Later on, I discovered it was with Margaret Sanger's friend's money, and I discovered, more things about it than I knew when I was writing that article. But again, I researched the hell out of it. Clay Felker was the editor at Esquire who assigned me that. And when I handed it in, he said, "You have performed the incredible feat of making sex dull," he said. So he sent me home and he said, "Okay, you've done this whole thing about how it developed as a fertility thing and John Rock and the science and everything. Let's talk about its impact." So I did. I went home and completely rewrote it in a more human way. And the amazing thing to me is that I see from going back that it ends up by saying, this may liberate women, but there may be too few liberated men to go around. Something that I didn't think I thought then, but I wrote anyway. Don't you find so often that something you said or did was your future state of mind and you didn't even know it?
And I also, because you mentioned Esquire, that Barbara was featured in Esquire in an article that was titled "A Bachelor's Choice of Marriageable Girls." And I think it was in 1962. So it was around the same time.
Right.
And I was wondering if if that article and you two were connected in some ways.
Yeah, because it was, I think Henry Wolf
Was the art director, probably.
yeah,
Mhm.
it was, what magazine was it again?
Esquire.
Esquire, yeah. They kind of like said, "No, you have to do it, you have to do it." And I said, no, I don't know whether I want to do it or not. No, you're going to do it. And I did it.
I encourage you to look for it in the library.
No, and
It's a wonderful photograph.
And there was another, Harold Hayes was the editor of Esquire for quite a while. And he just hated me because I was his wife's friend. And his wife had been a big star on Broadway before they were married. And she was so clearly, wanting to have something of this in her life. And he kind of forbade her to work outside the home. And I was an evil influence, What can I say?
So just to get back to Barbara's work, in 1972, we'll talk first, we have the launch of Ms. Magazine, and Barbara contributed a piece to the first
The
magazine.
Women in Madness piece.
Women in
with
Madness.
Phyllis Chesler.
And at the same time, for those of you who may not have seen Barbara's show yet or her book, Barbara was working on a series called Women Girls. And I wondered if you can just talk a little about, what you were thinking, what was your sensibility at that time to be recognizing the work that Gloria was doing with the new magazine and then contributing your work, which was really quite astonishing for the period. You were Women Girls.
I don't know. When you work for a magazine or when you work for advertising, you have an art director, a story, yourself, an editor. Everybody has to be satisfied. When you work for yourself, I don't want to think about anything, and I just want whatever it is to come out. And the Women Girls started coming out. I wasn't like thinking I'm going to do Women Girls, but they came out. And I didn't really know what I was doing in the beginning when I started working with them, but I know that I just like to keep working because I don't want to think too much when I do work for myself because I had all this thinking to do when I did work for magazines. So it's the balance of things. So the Women Girls came out and I just kind of looked at them like I wanted to know myself what I was doing. Because I don't think that you always know exactly what you're doing as an artist, you have to kind of let it flow, and then when you see a body of work, then you kind of get to understand the history of it. So that's kind of how it was. I wasn't thinking so much then. Then I kind of read what I did, and I had some ideas about what I was doing, just like anybody else would look at the work.
Right. So by the time Ms. was launched in 1972, you had really gone through a big change of consciousness. And so what made you consider a magazine as your, mouthpiece to reach other women and other...
Well, there'd been a sequence in my life. I mean, I had helped, along with lots of other writers, Jimmy Breslin and Tom Wolfe and lots of people, to start New York Magazine with Clay Felker, whom I knew from Esquire. And we had tap danced for rich people for years and otherwise managed to start New York Magazine. And so I had a political column. I named the departments in the magazine, so I gave myself the city politic that I wrote every week. And once the kind of women's movement began to dawn on me and everybody else, say, wait a minute, it doesn't have to be like this. Maybe we're not crazy. Maybe the system is crazy, that I began to write that in the column. And I got invitations to speak as a result, which I was terrified of because I had never spoken, but I absolutely did not want to speak in public. But meanwhile, other places were not taking articles about the women's movement, and editors would say things like, if we publish one article saying that women are equal, we'll have to publish one next to it saying they're not in order to be objective. So I thought, okay, that's not going to... And to some extent that was happening in New York, too, because women were being pitted against each other in New York. So I thought that I can only do this if I answer the speaking requests, but I was afraid to, so I asked my fearless friend, Dorothy Pittman Hughes, a child care expert. I mean, she was married with kids and with child care expert, everything. I'm not an African-American woman. Just somehow it made sense that we did it together, right? And from that experience, from going out from New York to Wichita, Kansas, where people here would be saying, they're going to stone you to death in Wichita, and then we would get there and there would be 3,000 people, in an auditorium, and eagerly, with the same kind of realization, this kind of big light bulb. Oh yes, it doesn't have to be this way. It is unfair. We can support. So I knew there was an audience for the magazine. That's the point. Otherwise, I would never have known.
And what were your specific goals, at the time? Or did you go into it with bright eyes? And how did you see it developing?
Well, our specific goals, we had lots of meetings of writers and editors, because the question was, were there enough people who couldn't write what they wanted to write for existing magazines to make this work? And of course there were. There were all kinds of people. So our specific goal really was to be able to publish our work and work for a magazine we read. Because we didn't read, we read the other women's magazines when we wanted to buy clothes, or there's one profile, but it wasn't about our lives, really. It didn't connect to us. And it was so much the opposite of what was going on with this burgeoning kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, feminist realization that came out of the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, in which movements that we loved, and but women were also not equal in. So you had to think, well, maybe there has to be, an additional kind of movement. So they couldn't publish what they wanted either, and therefore we thought, well, we'll try it. We'll put out a preview issue, so to speak, a sample issue, and see what happens.
And the rest is history.
And that was the one that was in New York Magazine as a
sample, yes.
Yeah.
Clay Felker generously, he was looking for a big feature for his year-end issue, which he always did. And so he said if he could have whatever 30 pages he wanted of our first issue, then he would subsidize the whole first issue of 130 pages and send it out as a sample. Without that, we wouldn't have been able to proceed or raise money, without the success of that one issue.
So going back again to the visual, the first independent issue of Ms. featured Wonder Woman on the cover. And I'm sure many of you in the audience recently read the profile that was in the New Yorker. I knew nothing about the history of Wonder Woman. I wondered if you did at the time that you put Wonder Woman on the cover.
No, not really. I mean, I had grown up reading Wonder Woman because it was the only, except for Sheena of the Jungle, anybody remember? It was the only female superhero. And also, at that time, the boys' comics were so violent that there had been a congressional hearing on them. They were so sadistic and violent coming out of World War II. Wonder Woman had been invented precisely to oppose that kind of violence. So she didn't kill anybody, she converted people, she had a lasso that made people tell the truth. You know, she had an invisible, I mean, you know, what more could you want? She had a great costume, you know. So I had grown up reading it. And I thought, well, that'd be a great cover. But when I went to look at what had become of Wonder Woman, she was in terrible shape. She during after World War II, and when her original creator died, I guess, she had become like a car hop. You know, she'd lost all her magical powers, no bracelets to bounce bullets off, no lasso. So we began to haunt the offices of DC Comics and say, you must, you know, give her back herself. And in order to show that there was support for that, we put her on the cover and we published several Golden Age strips of Wonder Woman. And we just made total nuisances of ourselves at DC Comics. And there was a guy who ran Wonder Woman at that time, an older Italian guy who was just so tired of us pressuring him all the time. And finally he called up, he said, okay, she's got her magic lasso back, she's got the rest of it, you know, and she has an African Amazon sister named Nubia. He said, now will you leave me alone? So it was, we partly did it on the cover in order to rescue Wonder Woman.
Wonderful.
I never heard that story. I love it. Perfect.
And Nina referred to your Star Girl, which was much earlier, but it shares some of the features of Wonder Woman.
Yeah, she had the star and the. She didn't have them here. She had here.
On her cuff. Yeah.
She had muscles now. Yeah, and I guess underneath it all, that's what I was doing, a Wonder Woman in disguise a little bit. But, you know, a woman who's powerful, who's there, who, you know, she's present. And she wants to be there. She's not like trying to pretend she's somebody else or whatever. And I think that that's important. But of course, when I did it, I didn't think that. You know, I only think that when I look at it. If you just do what you feel in your heart, it comes out right. So, sort of. I think, I hope.
So, did you ever feel you had to sort of put your own ideas, values, things on the side to do the work that you had to do commercially?
No, I never did.
And is that because you were able to pick and choose things, or you just...
I think because I had, my life was a very flowing life. Like I always had my sketchbooks. And my sketchbooks, I did anything I wanted. So everything that I wanted to do, I did. And then I made money. So like that allowed me to do that. And I think that the freedom of that, you know, doing work for publication, which I liked what I did for that as well, my freedom was in the work that I did in my sketchbooks. And my sketchbooks and my own work influenced the work that I did for publication. So I felt I never felt like I was sublimating myself in any way. And I was very happy with my life, as I am now.
But I think also it's significant that we managed, both of us, really speaking, never to have a job. And I think that's really important, you know, because, I mean, from the point of view of social justice movements, as well as being an artist, but you need a certain percentage of people who can't be fired. Right? It's crucial, because once you're totally dependent on a check in a situation, it's very hard. I don't think anybody can fail to start to censor themselves. And, you know, I was lucky in having a father who had 2 points of pride. He never had a job and he never wore a hat. Those were his so he had kind of introduced me to that way of life. And I was lucky in finding Barbara as a roommate. You know, suppose I'd found somebody who was, you know, making tons of money from J. Walter Thompson or something. I might have been tempted to, I mean, you know.
We were
was the
perfect together. We
match.
both didn't cook.
You're right.
Actually, Barbara has told me that people were very suspicious because you didn't have a real job. Because a real job for a woman might have been a teacher or a nurse or a secretary.
They weren't sure what I was and what I really did for a living. But these were men who weren't artists and weren't in the field that I was in. Art directors, no problem. Artists, no problem. But it was people who sold cars. Then what do you do? How do you make a living? You do drawings and you sell them to magazines? Like that. Like, really? You say, I like to salsa dance, and I used to go to the Palladium, and you would meet not artists at the Palladium, salsa dancing. And so when somebody asked you what you did, you told them. And so then, after a few of those, like, what do you do? I decided to pretend I was my sister who had a job at Pepsi-Cola. She was a secretary. And that's what I did for a living. I was a secretary, worked for Pepsi-Cola, and it was no problem. But this was just like normal people, not artists.
Did you feel any of that sort of conflict of, having to explain? I mean, obviously your life was much more public at a certain point.
It might be easier to say you're a freelance writer, I guess. I mean, people maybe were infinitesimally more familiar with that. But I do remember being hired by one of the biggest women's magazines to do a local edition in the back so they could sell local ads, so just a New York edition in the back of this national magazine. And I was contentedly doing that at home. And then they had the nerve to ask me to be in the office 2 days a week. And I quit. And I quit, and I went outside and I walked around in the street. I bought an ice cream cone. I walked in the street, And I'm sure that was my father that helped. That was Barbara that helped, It's a state of mind, it's like you may end up actually working harder and longer, but you can make your own decisions. You feel free.
Mm-hmm. I know that Nina also referred to this, and for me, working on your show and coming to know you and your work, so from the outside looking in, that I can see how you two could be kindred spirits, and you've actually articulated that to us tonight. I mean, how you had, you're coming from different places, but you shared certain values of work, and I think that's significant, that you both had goals as working women, and that was something I know that was so important to Barbara, that you wanted to be an independent working woman. And when I look at your work, that I see so many things in it that are about women's issues, from the women girls, from the later work where you did a really wonderful satirical poster, which is called How to Separate an Egg, which is about artificial insemination, to your flag series, which are about these sort of relationships between men and women. And you have always said, as we've gone through this process, and knowing your friendship with Gloria, that you never really considered yourself a feminist. Dare I say the word?
Oh, no, I said I'm a natural feminist.
Oh, a natural feminist. Okay.
That's
But you
natural. You know, I was always a feminist, except I didn't know until we identified it.
But you weren't involved in the sort of more organized activities that may have
No,
been
she was,
around.
Barbara was always contributing her artwork to everything
Yeah,
we did,
yeah.
and, you know, to all the
I
with
just-
posters, and, no, she was
Yeah, I
totally
mean, I was there, I just
Yeah.
wasn't marching, you know, I mean, it was just a different kind of way that I was there. I was there by example of how I lived my life and just what I did and what I didn't do. I think it was more in that way. I felt more, you know, I never wanted to do something I didn't feel comfortable doing. And that's how I lived.
And I'm not sure, I mean, if now, in retrospect, we pretend that we planned forward and knew what we were doing in the future, we
No.
would not be telling the truth, and it isn't the way we live our lives, probably, you know, so any of us, in a way, you know. So I certainly, I was doing all these things, but I, at the same time, totally believed that you had to get married and have children, because if you didn't, you were crazy. That was the attitude of society, pretty much, and the only woman in my family who had not married and had children was crazy. She was my cousin, who was so, who was just maybe 20 years older than I. So I just kept pushing it off into the future. But it isn't as if you know the end or the middle of the story.
Right.
You just strive to be yourself along the way and see what happens.
Yeah, and I always thought that I would get married like then,
Right.
then, you
Yes,
know,
we
but not
both
now. I had to
yes.
do
Oh,
this
we're going to
now.
do that, just not now.
Yeah, right.
Right. Right.
Well, and I bring that up because again, to affirm that in your work, it's so clearly that the example of what you poured out of yourself in your work is so clearly someone who is conscious of the role of women and the role she plays in society. So I commend you on that.
Why, thank you. I wish I knew that.
Well, now you do.
You know, yes, now I do.
So I want to sort of draw our formal conversation to a close and maybe just ask sort of a final word. I mean, we are an academic institution, and I imagine that we have young people here from our own program and listening, perhaps live streaming. And I wonder if you could give a sort of word of advice for people trying to start their careers now in the arts.
Well, I mean, my most basic advice is don't listen to me, listen to yourself. You know, listen to that voice inside. And what are the tests of it? I would say doing what you love so much you forget what time it is when you're doing it. Doing something you would do even if you didn't get paid, though I want you to get paid. And if you can do that along the way, then you'll end up where you want to go. And just don't worry so much. You know, don't worry so much. I am not a good. I can't. I tell other people to live in the present. I live in the future myself. So.
That's good advice.
But still, I think we get in trouble when we sacrifice the means to the ends. You know, we're doing something just because we want it. But the means are the ends. The means we choose tell us the ends we're going to get. So don't ever be any place you can't laugh. You know, don't ever be, including churches.
And Barbara, you have been an educator. You've always been sort of on the front lines with young people developing talent. What would your advice be?
Yeah, I love teaching when I had my classes, and basically I always try to draw each person out, the individual, like I'm me and you're you, and you're you, and you're you. There's only one of you, and there's only one of me. So don't try and mimic anyone, just try and figure out who that is inside you, and then identify that and just let it flow. Don't be too conscious, don't be unconscious, just try and figure out that space in there of who you are and what you can bring to the table, to this life and this world. And it worked because then they had to look inside. They weren't looking at me for answers. I was just the guide to kind of talk about their work and just give it back to them so that they can see who they are. And I think that I don't have any advice for anybody except ditto what Gloria said, be yourself as much as you can be.
And that's what great teachers do. And I was thinking, seeing the exhibit here, which of course is so much bigger and more wonderful, therefore, than what was at the Victoria and Albert. But still, when we, friends of Barbara's, came to London because this amazing, life retrospective for the Victoria and Albert to do was great, right? So we went there to celebrate, and there was not one person there or anywhere in the world who said for 1 minute or thought for 1 minute that Barbara did not 100% deserve absolutely every possible celebration and support, because she has always been so generous in the way, you can see from the way she teaches, but also she just like that. If somebody stops her on the street for direction, she'll probably walk there with them.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope everyone join us in thanking Barbara and Gloria. So we do have time to take some questions.
I just want to say one thing. I learned so much just now from Gloria, even though we lived together for 6 years in one room. You never stop learning about your friends.
Right.
The lady here.
I had a question. I wanted to ask Ms. Steinem if she might comment on the difference between Betty Friedan's legacy and her own, or how she viewed that particular subject.
Well, I think, if you're part of a movement that is a big movement, everybody thinks you totally know each other. And we maybe saw each other maybe 6 times, and sometimes they were at meetings, mostly they were at meetings. I don't think we ever saw each other by ourselves. She was a decade older than me and wrote, obviously, The Feminine Mystique, a very, very, very important book, which didn't speak to my situation, but spoke to millions. It was really about women married, living in the suburbs, college educated, saying to themselves, there must be more to life than this, right? Very, very important. I was already in the labor force, not married, not in the suburbs, still getting screwed in the labor force. So what appealed to, the people who appealed to me were more the younger women, often younger than me, who were in the civil rights movement, in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and who were identifying something that happened to females as a caste. And that, spoke to me, actually. But, we all come from what we experienced, and that, so we ended up founding the National Women's Political Caucus together, in effect, even though we didn't know each other that well, right?
In the back there, yes.
My name is Barbara Linton. I want to tell you that from a lifetime of being an admirer, I want to quote Arthur Schopenhauer, who said that talent hits a target that no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. Thank you.
So in light of what's happening right now in terms of racial tension and the backlash against feminism, how young women don't want to call themselves feminists, I've noticed, like at least within my demographic, one of the reasons, like I see it in social media, the country's so divided, and it's a lot of times it's because young people don't have a historical perspective on movements. So I could see in my generation, they're like trying to articulate how to react to the news right now. As someone who like started a movement, how do you get, because I would think I would want more young women to meet you, but a lot of people don't know about you who are my age. How do you start a dialogue between people who have a perspective and how you can make a difference in society to people right now who are obsessed with Kim Kardashian? Like, how do you bridge that?
Well, just by way of comfort, I would say that actually the statistics on people, women and men, who call themselves feminists and who support feminist issues and so on, have gone up. I mean, if you think it's bad now, you should have seen and also it's the facts are the opposite of the kind of image in another way, which is that women of color, or well, the public opinion polls were only of black women actually in the beginning. And we published one, Lou Harris, a big, huge poll, in which the question of identifying as a feminist to feminist issues was this poll, right? And over 60% of black women identified, and only some 30% of white women. You know, it's, I think the image and the reality is not necessary. It's not that it's untrue, but it's less true, you know. But I think, you know, you just...
But how are you reaching out to younger women?
Well, you know, I speak on campuses a lot, several a month usually. And I'm not there, but the point is, I am not there to tell them what to do. I am there to listen and to see what it is that they want to do that I can both learn from and help with. And as long as every relationship has to be equal, including between the young and the old, it just doesn't work. It has to be in balance. And I feel so heartened by what I see young women doing. I mean, their shit detectors are so much better than ours. And I hope that we've gotten smarter about the fact that you can't be a feminist without being anti-racist, and you can't be you know, because it's all about controlling reproduction. That's the whole ball game. That's how women, if we didn't have wombs, we'd be fine. You know? So if there is race and class and, you know, all these kind of divisions, then it's going to be even worse for women, because these women over here have to be pure, you know, and keep the white race, and these women over here. One is restricted, the other's exploited. These movements are just all interlinked, just totally intertwined, and I hope that there's a better understanding of that now. I mean, if, you know, speaking about all these horrors that have been happening, I don't know that much about the lives of these cops, but if Zimmerman had been, in Florida, had been arrested for domestic abuse of women, then the young man he killed would still be alive. You know, these things, because he's got an attitude of dominance. And the more we link them, I think, the stronger we are.
I have a question over here in the left.
Barbara, I have a question. In your very decisive, it sounds, approach, in your decisive, what it sounds, approach to your career and your future, what you wanted to do as an artist, did you ever reach a point where you had kind of a writer's block, that you questioned what it was you were actually creating, that kind of manifested a void in a direction that maybe you were not following, that kind of created a style or something out of that confusion that you struggled with to find the direction that you eventually took?
So he asked me, did I ever have like artist block?
Right.
And did I ever have a struggle with what I was doing? And the answer is kind of no. I'm sorry. I know that it sounds weird, but, I think because I always had a sketchbook and I always kind of did what I wanted to do in that sketchbook. It was like my release. And so I always went to my sketchbook when I had a job. So there was always like a million things there that I could use for this job. So I really never had like a block to say, oh, I can never do this job. But I never got jobs that I couldn't do. I mean, nobody would ask me to do an automobile advertisement. That would be something I probably couldn't do. It was always something that came to me that I could do.
Well, one of the remarkable things, I don't know if you've seen the exhibit, but they're Barbara's sketchbooks. And one of the rules of her sketchbook is no torn out pages.
Yeah.
And so they're daily, it's amazing. Because believe me, writers tear up pages all the time.
Yeah, well, I think that it's important to see everything you do, even if you don't like it, because you have to see the whole picture in order to know this whole picture. So if you put out that picture there, then you know what this picture is. I love everything I do. Who could? But I want to see that. I want to remind myself, I didn't like that so much.
Question here?
Yeah, Barbara, I'm curious as to how technology might have affected your creative work and as well as your teaching.
How did technology affect your creative work and your teaching? Thank you.
It's not a sketchbook anymore for a lot of young people.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true, but you still approach it from here. I was fascinated with technology, and I started working with it in very early, like 1982, and I wanted to teach myself how to use technology because I felt like it was something that I didn't know about, and I wanted to know about it. And the more I knew about it, the more I knew that computers were going to be important in our lives. And they are. Like everybody, and I would tell people, everybody is going to have a computer. You're going to walk around with one, and they would just look at me as though I was crazy. So
You saw something for the future.
what about the future?
You saw something for the future.
You were always saying that you just did things, but here obviously you really had an intuition.
Yeah, I felt like it was going to be something that we would all be using. Maybe I don't understand the question.
You're a futurist.
Yeah, I just knew. And the more I knew about it, the more I knew that it was going to be all over the place, ubiquitous, every place.
I don't know if you've seen the 3 floors of Barbara's exhibit,
Yes.
but you see how early she was looking at technology and teaching computer art and carrying this. I mean, she, I have to say, was the last person I thought would be a pioneer.
There it is.
But it's true.
Here it is.
And while I was walking through this exhibit, I thought, Andy Warhol, she covers the same period of time, he was such a fraud. He pretended he invented the consciousness of technology. He did not. He did not. She was so much more early and certain and teaching people and, traveling with this and incorporating it in her work. I have gotten such a hate on Andy Warhol just for using I put on my Facebook, you should pardon the expression, Facebook, that people in New York should come see her exhibit, people in Pittsburgh should picket the bastard.
There's a question in the back of the room. Yes, the young woman there, one of us
Hi, I'm a
students.
graduate student here at the Bard Graduate Center. And I'm also a graduate of a women's college. And I'm curious about what you think the role of women's colleges is today.
She's asking Gloria about women's colleges.
I think they have a very important role. I think historically women's colleges, historically black colleges, because it's really good for people who have been maybe on the periphery to have an experience of being central. Not everybody needs it. It's there as an option. But I think it's very important.
And yes.
When I complained to my friends that yes, in the 70s we wore mini skirts, but we're not wearing, or rather young women these days are wearing things that are less and less and less in the media. So I will, and they'll say to me, well, you're complaining because you're old. And I say, I'm complaining because how are women not going to be perceived as sexual objects when clearly that's how they want to be perceived, and that's how we see it in the media.
You're asking me?
I'm asking.
I didn't hear her.
She's commenting on the fact that today in the media, many young women, in the way they dress, present themselves as sexualized objects, and that maybe perhaps back in the 60s and early 70s, even though there were miniskirts and other things, it didn't carry the same weight. Am I paraphrasing?
I think you mean in life, not necessarily in the media, right? That women are, young women are dressing in a
And so
body revealing.
how do they think they can move forward and not be considered sexual objects?
Well, I think, everything depends on the why. If they're dressing that way because they think they have to and they don't really want to and they feel exposed and vulnerable, so it's not good. If they're dressing that way because they're body proud, I say, why not? We should be able to be nude and walk through the street and be safe. And I think us older folks, because we remember a time of more when it was judgmental, it was more judgmental, and it was less likely that you would be able to do that. We worry about them. We're afraid. We want to protect them. But if it's out of body pride and personal decision that I'm going to do this, why not?
One more question.
Just sort of as a follow-up to the last statement, as a young person today, I think a lot about the women's movement coming back around today is young women having the option to present themselves in that way and have that option of representation. And just because somebody wears a crop top and short little shorts doesn't mean they're not a feminist. That's just how they're choosing to present themselves. And I don't really have a question. I'm just
Giving her perspective. Thank you. She was just
No,
giving
well,
her
if you think
perspective.
about what we were doing too, I mean, we were wearing mini skirts and buttons that said "cunt power." I mean, excuse me.
Well, thank you all for being here tonight,
I didn't mean
and
to
please
end on
see the
that.
exhibition. Please see the exhibition.